If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. So when I woke up this morning,
Yeah.
I don't know, do you ever have this, like you wake up in the morning and I don't know whether like you're having a dream or something's going on in your head and you have this first thought. And for whatever reason, when I woke up this morning, the first thought I had, it's a little bit embarrassing. The first thought I had, like 5:45 or whatever time my alarm sort of buzzed. And the first thought I had upon waking was, isn't pulchritude a funny word?
Yeah. It is a funny word.
It is a funny word. And it was like, my wife's asleep there and I like wake up and I go, pulchritude is a funny word. I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea why.
Honey, wake up. Yeah.
But I was thinking about this, and it's a funny word because of what it sounds like and what it means. If I say the word pulchritude, and it's spelled Pulchritud, what does that sound like?
It sounds like the word putrid.
Like putrid, right? Like pulchritude, you go like a decomposing body or something. When somebody hits a deer here on the road or whatever, there's like a roadkill deer, and you're driving along or you're going for a jog or something, and you're going down, and there's like a deer that's been laying there for 4 days, and it's like flies and stuff all over it, and you go, oh, pulchritude. That's what it sounds.
Yeah.
And I remember waking up this morning going, isn't it funny? Because pulchritude actually means beautiful.
Well,
in Latin, pulcher is beautiful.
I'm going to leave that one alone with my wife.
Pulchritude, you go, that means beautiful. And so then you can use it as like the adjective, pulchritudinous is the adjective.
Oh, yeah. You like this dress? That dress is pulchritudinous.
I woke up this morning and I looked over at my sleeping wife and I thought, she's very pulchritudinous. I almost shook her awake and said, honey, you're pulchritudinous to me.
That would have been a double whammy there.
That's right. That's right. I just think that's funny.
This gives me an idea. I remember like a year ago or more, I used the word solipsism or solipsistic because I had just learned it.
Oh yeah.
When I read books, I sit with my phone and I look up words that I don't know.
Everybody out there, you should always look up words you don't know.
Or like they'll describe something. So I'll like this famous building or something. So I'll stop and pull it up and look at a picture of it, whatever. We should have like a word of the week or a word of the podcast, and people have to listen for it, but we don't say what it is.
Oh, you like work it in.
Yeah. So this week we are going to work a certain word into the conversation, and your job is to listen and write in and tell us what word you think we were trying to slip in to sound smart.
But we should have talked about this before we started the recorder, because I don't know what the secret word is.
There isn't one this week because I just thought of it.
Oh, so next week.
So like next time.
Okay.
Next time.
Today, the word of the day is pulchritude or pulchritude. Right. Let's see if we can try to work it into a sentence somewhere in this episode.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And then maybe we could have a little contest. I have no idea what that even looks like. First person will read the timestamps on an email, and the first one in
something. Okay. Anyway, we do need to get to the topic.
Right.
And what I would like to have a conversation about is politics and Catholicism. So we just had a conversation about patriotism, but I want to talk about politics. Because again, like obviously, this is a time that's very polarized on our politics. So of course I say that, but I think when in history wasn't politics polarizing, right? Pick any era, and there's always polarization around politics and conflict. But right now with social media and everything else, everything is all torn up, and everybody's got their knickers in a twist about everything, right? And it's divisive. And you and I were talking about at lunch about people we know that like you just can't talk to them about anything, and conversation is, hey, let's talk about the weather or anything beyond that.
Right.
You can't talk because everybody's all wound up about politics, right? And I got to thinking about a lot of people who've asked me, if I become Catholic, do I have to adopt the politics or the political positions of Catholic leaders?
See, that's something that I have wondered about.
So, this came up recently, and I'll just put this issue out here. And I know that this is going to be polarizing to everybody listening, but it makes the point. It illustrates it. Is that the United States Council of Catholic Bishops and the Vatican have issued statements recently opining on the immigration policies of the United States. Okay.
I read a little bit about that.
Yeah. And they come out with these rather strong statements that we take a very particular position on this issue and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Okay. And then you have people who are listening, who are either Catholic or considering Catholicism, who go, oh, if the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, or if somebody in the Vatican, or if Father so-and-so, or if the bishop in my diocese takes a position on whatever political issue, am I bound to agree with that?
And this comes up when the people in my life who think I should not be considering Catholicism are always pointing to those things and saying, see, the Catholics think that this, or the Catholics think that, with regard to politics.
And part of that is because the Catholic Church is a singular institution,
right?
Unlike any other denomination. There is no other Christian denomination or that I'm aware of, even religion, not Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, where it is a singular institution.
Right.
It's 2,000 years, the Pope, the successor of Peter, the institution, the bishops. It is so when there is division of opinion or differences of opinion among, say, Protestant pastors, you just go, Pastor Bill says this and Pastor Josh says that.
Right.
Even within their denominations, or if you say, hey, this small denomination took a position, but other people in the denomination didn't. So with Catholicism, the Catholic Church, in a sense, has to own, in the sense of everybody knows if the Pope says something, or the Vatican says something, or the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, or if some big prominent Catholic bishop says something, or cardinal says something, then you automatically ask, do we all have to agree with that? Whereas if Pastor Josh, the pastor of the mega church down the road, says something, nobody assumes that all evangelicals have to agree with Pastor Josh. So I get where that comes from. And there's questions about what are the boundaries of what the church can declare and that we have to agree with. So let's talk about this a little bit, because I think it's interesting. And let's start with the Pope. Okay. Let's start at the top, right? So people will say, the Catholics are controlled by the Pope, and the Pope was infallible, and whatever the Pope says goes.
Right.
And Catholics all have to get in line behind him. But it's interesting because the church's teaching about authority, the magisterium, is binding only on Catholics in matters of faith or doctrine or morals, not in, and we'll get into this in a minute, what are called prudential judgments or political opinions. Okay. And I pulled a couple of quotes here. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, 891 paragraph, says the Roman pontiff, that's the Pope, enjoys this infallibility when, as supreme pastor and teacher of all the faithful, he proclaims by a definitive act a doctrine pertaining to faith, like what was to be believed, or morals. Okay. So it limits it to doctrinal or dogmatic matters or moral issues. But the Pope is not infallible and has no ability to declare his opinion about particular things that are not a matter of dogma or morals. Let me get a couple other quotes, or at least one other. St. John Paul II, 20 years ago or so, said, the church has no models, and by that he means political models to present. He said models that are real and truly effective can only arise within the framework of different historical situations through the efforts of all those who responsibly confront concrete problems. So he's saying that the church doesn't dictate political systems or policies, but it provides the moral principles. Right. So I was thinking about this. If you go back over the last 2,000 years, Catholicism has existed under the Roman imperial Caesars. It existed under the feudal kingdoms and feudalism of the Middle Ages. It existed under the imperial, like the British Empire and the French Empire. It existed under the nation states, the 18th and 19th and 20th century. The Catholic Church has existed under a lot of different political models and systems over the centuries and around the world. Yep. And there's no one that says, oh, feudalism is the model for Catholicism or whatever. Right. What it does is it dictates what is dogmatically true. There's a Trinity and Jesus rose and again, and all those things. Right. And then it dictates our moral obligations. But it doesn't tell us how those have to be implemented. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I find that comforting because it's easy in my experience all my life with the evangelical church. They'll take positions that are outside the scope of theology and morals and all that doctrine, and then there's nobody there to police them, and you end up going and looking for a different church.
Yeah, and if the Pope's political opinions were binding, then you have a problem because over the centuries, over 270 popes have given, and they have a right to give their opinions about political issues, but they've given opinions over the centuries in different historical contexts that are now obsolete. So like Pope Pius IX, Pope during the 19th century, this is when Italian unification, so, all the different little nation states that were on the Italian peninsula, they were trying to unite and become one country called Italy. And one of the little nation states was the Papal States, ruled by the Pope. And Pius IX was very strident in that he opposed Italian unification. So totally against that. Okay. Now it's happened. It's 150 years later or whatever. And if Pius IX's position that Italy should not be a country were still binding because it was infallible, then should Catholics in Italy not participate in their country or try to overthrow it? That's silly. And you could go back and see at various times popes have weighed in on particular situations at a particular time and place. And some of that's not always binding. And here's I think a good way to think of it. Somebody came up with this. I can't remember where I read it, but they talked about the difference between a compass and a GPS map, like Google Maps or Apple Maps or something. Because if a compass tells you a direction, like this is north. Right. And you're supposed to go north. There's a lot of different routes. You can go take this road, right, to get north. A GPS tells you turn left on this street, go up this street, turn right on that street. And it dictates a path. And what the Catholic Church does is it will give us not only doctrinal, but particularly moral principles that we are bound. Because again, the church teaches us faith and morals. And so let me give you an example. Think about the poor. I think this is a good example. Jesus, pretty clearly, Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, from beginning to end, tells us that we're to care about the poor. Right. Where the Catholic Church teaches absolutely not only that should we care about the common good, but we should have a particular care for the poor. Yeah. Okay? And their situation. That is an unimpeachable moral teaching that the church gives. And you can't be a faithful Catholic and not care about the common good and the welfare of the poor. Right. The question becomes, what political policy, what politician or party or platform should you vote for that best advances the interests of the poor. Because that's going to differ from one decade to the next, maybe. And it's going to differ maybe depending on where you are in different cities or states or countries. What is good for the poor in this community, in this nation, at this time, in terms of a political policy, might differ from what political policy or government action would best help the poor in a different city and nation and era.
True.
Right? And church can't really dictate how you help them. We have a lot of very interesting conversations about this.
Thanks for listening. My name is Greg Smith, and I'm so grateful for my guests, those who leave ratings and reviews on the podcast platforms, and all of you who share the podcast with others. I really love to hear your thoughts, your questions, and your stories. So email me at consideringcatholicism@gmail.com or leave a comment or review on the website at consideringcatholicism.com. This podcast doesn't take ad revenue, and it doesn't make money on clicks. It is 100% supported by donors who believe in this ministry. And to my donors, I want to thank you because you keep me going. You help me cover my costs, and you let me dedicate more time to researching, writing, recording, and editing to get the episodes out to you faster and to engage the community of listeners who send in their questions and comments. I entirely trust the Lord to provide through you. And if you aren't already a supporter, would you consider giving a one-time or recurring donation through the links in the show notes or on the website so this ministry can continue and grow and help others to consider Catholicism? Thank you, and now back to the show.
My wife and I were talking the other day about she had a new employee where she works, and it was a young woman who's really struggling to pull herself out of poverty.
Yeah.
And so my wife and I were talking over dinner about the struggles that this young woman is having to pull her life, to pull her, improve her circumstances and her situation, and all the difficulties from childcare to transportation to education to 1,000 things, that housing, that make that hard for her. I remember over dinner, my wife and I just kept talking about it and thinking about what would be most helpful to this young woman, and maybe some policies that our federal or state or local government is pursuing help her, and some actually make it harder for her.
Yeah.
And so then you come down to what seems unimpeachable is that we should care about the poor, and we should vote and support policies that help them. But which particular policy?
Right.
Would the poor be best served by just giving everybody a check? If you could if the government could just write this young woman a $10,000 check every month, would that fix everything? Would it, or not? Or might it make certain things worse? Like it might make housing unaffordable because now everybody with their $10,000 a month check is competing for the same limited number of apartments, and the rent goes up. So, there's all these unintended consequences, right?
It's utterly impractical anyway, because what works today won't work tomorrow, and then you'd have to rescind it, and then you'd have to, you can't do that. You can't go down that road.
Yeah, or you look at things like education and you say, okay, or you look at like immigration that we talked about, or you look at issues of foreign policy. The Pope and the church will come out and say we should support peace and justice and the common good around the world.
Right.
But when it comes to some particular situation, those are very difficult issues about what's the best policy here. We could think of 1,000 different scenarios around the world where you go, man, it's really hard to know what the right thing to do in this particular time and place is.
Yeah.
That best advances justice and peace and the common good, and people can have real differences of opinion. In Catholicism, this is often talked about. The fancy term is prudential judgment, like prudence. Prudence is like wisdom.
Yep.
And prudential judgment means you and I can both look at a situation and say we both are bound by our faith to have the same moral compass.
Right.
but we can both look at it and evaluate it and think that there's two different methods.
So there's room to disagree with your local priest or the bishop or the whoever, and you can disagree with them about it because it's not a matter of doctrine or.
Yeah. In fact, the Catholic Church talks about your right to act according to your conscience.
Okay.
Assuming your conscience is a well-formed conscience.
Right.
In other words, not just your desires, but your conscience has been formed by your Catholic faith. So you've got your sort of moral principles straight, your moral compass straight.
Yep.
Right? So your conscience has been formed by Catholic faith and Catholic morals. But then your conscience might dictate different particular sort of actions or policies that you think are consistent with that. So a couple of quick little quotes here. Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1782. Man has the right to act in conscience and in freedom so as personally to make moral decisions. He must not be forced to act contrary to his conscience, nor must he be prevented from acting according to his conscience, especially in religious matters. In a sense, the church teaches you what is true doctrinally and what is right morally, but how that is to be implemented in a particular time and place and situation, there's a lot of latitude, and you can act according to your conscience, assuming that your conscience is legitimate and authentic. In other words, if my conscience just tells me I'm going to do what I want to do, serve my own, right? But assuming my conscience really is consistent with the teachings of the church and the moral principles of the church, we can disagree about economic policy. We can disagree about what kind of a foreign policy ought to be applied to the civil war in some country halfway around the world, right?
So are these bishops who are espousing these political views, do they have a responsibility not to do that?
Yes and no. So the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops and the bishops in general are supposed to, and I think they generally do, refrain from using their authority to tell people how to vote, except in some very narrow situations, in which they say there is no legitimate alternative to this. And let me give you the two examples that stand out most, and that's abortion or euthanasia.
Okay.
Where you would say, okay, there is, as we've been saying, there is maybe different ways to implement something or other, but there's no way to sanction the elimination of unborn children or old people. There's no legitimate path.
That's never right.
That's never right. And the Catholic Church does teach there are certain things that are always and in every situation wrong. Committing euthanasia on an old person is always and everywhere morally wrong. And there are a few issues like that where the church has said there's no other compromise, and the bishops have come out and have said, hey, we encourage people to vote, against abortion and euthanasia or whatever, right? And you can think of some other things like that. Obviously, the position of the church evolved over this. I don't want to touch this right now because maybe we should have an episode on it. But the church never supported slavery in the sense that saying slavery was right. What the church said from ancient times, even St. Paul says it in his letters when he talks about slaves obey your masters, is the reality that slavery was a part of the world, part of the world system. And that if it was going to be part of the world system, then the church always spoke about how if there's going to be slavery, at least there should be justice and it should be regulated. But at a certain point, the church finally said enough is enough and is enough. And the church said that part of that old ancient system is gone and slavery is everywhere and always wrong. The church would say the same thing about voting for, say, legal prostitution or legal sex trafficking or something like that. Like it's everywhere and always wrong. There's no way you can say, hey, I agree with the church on a lot of things, but on the sex trafficking thing, I think it's okay. So there may
Right.
be some issues that are so blatantly clear. On others, the bishops are supposed to refrain from telling people how to vote, but they also, at times, and the Pope can say, I don't have authority to tell you what to do, but I can give you advice. It'd be like if your grandfather came and gave you advice.
Right.
And you should listen to him because he's a great man and someone
Right.
most close to Christ and all this kind of stuff. And you should listen to their input and take it with respect, but he can't bind you on some
Right.
of these matters. So there's times when the bishops or the popes opine about things, but we're not bound in many of those things to obey
Right.
their opinion.
Yep.
And again, where are the lines for these things? So this is how this came up with the immigration thing. The Catholic Church says, on the one hand, countries, right in the Catechism. Catechism says nations have a right to guard their border, to regulate their
Right.
borders and
Yeah.
regulate immigration. That's
Sure.
the right of a nation state. On the other hand, there is a sort of right of migration that's built into humanity. People from the time of Abraham have traveled around the world to seek opportunities,
Right.
and that you have to balance, the Catechism says, the
Yeah.
right of nations to regulate immigration and the right of immigrants to migrate. And there has to be
Right.
struck some kind of harmonious balance. But voting for the position, some of that's prudential judgment about where those boundaries lie. And sometimes you're going to have some bishop or pope or priest who's going to share his opinion about that prudential judgment. But again, if your conscience is well formed in Catholic faith and morals, you have the right to obey your own good conscience in that matter.
Yeah.
And you may say, I respect that, but I don't totally agree with you. I agree with you on the principle, but I don't agree with you on the implementation.
I like this because there's wiggle room within an order.
Yeah.
And that's not what I found in outside the Catholic world. You know what I mean? It's just it's the Wild West.
It is. And of course, in evangelicalism, it is a Wild West. You have some that are really evangelical churches that are really identified with various political agendas in America. Some of them super right wing, some of them super left wing, some of them all over the board, and you're captive to that. What I think is interesting, another quick quote here is from Vatican II, Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 76, says, the church, by reason of her role and competence, is not identified in any way with the political community nor bound to any political system. So in other words, the Catholic Church stands above and across feudalism and imperialism and nation states and all these different things. It's existed in all of these forms.
Yep.
And the Catholic Church isn't identified with medieval feudalism or whatever. And I think, I use an example, but this is a metaphor, but like the devil is in the details, right?
Yeah.
At some point, you have to get down to concrete policies and you have to say, okay, it's all well and good to say we care about the poor. We all get that. We all have well-formed consciences. But we're going to have a lot of disagreements about what should be marginal tax rates or this or that, or what kind of mechanisms and local policies should. Affordable housing is a big issue, right? But a lot of times when local governments try to impose rent controls, it backfires and makes things harder.
Right.
And you can have a rip-roaring conversation and disagreement with another Catholic, and you both are committed to caring for the poor and disagree about whether there ought to be rent controls on apartments in your city, right? I mean, because we should all be trying to get to that place, that moral place, but we do have a conscience and we do have prudential judgment on these matters.
It's a thing that will always, in this life, will always need to be wrestled with.
Yeah, because
there's no way out.
Right? I mean, because it's just like we talked about in the last conversation, you can't live in the universal. You can't live in the abstract.
Right.
It's all well and good to talk about abstractions, about justice and the poor and all those things. And those are real transcendental principles, but at some point they have to be implemented
Right.
within a real time and a real place with real people.
The poor person,
how they get implemented is,
the poor person down the street from you doesn't belong to all those categories. They belong to one.
Yeah.
And you have to engage with that.
Sure. You have to at some point you can't put bumper stickers on your car and just on things on your social media, quotes about justice and peace and all that. Sure. We all believe in justice and peace, but what is justice in this particular situation at this particular time,
right,
under these particular circumstances, and what brings most peace and prosperity or whatever in this particular circumstance at this particular time, given these factors.
Right.
And those are all prudential judgments. And that's why we need not only priests and bishops and cardinals and popes, but you need Catholic economists and Catholic technologists and Catholic statesmen and politicians, because they have to have the expertise in those matters.
Yep.
To weigh in and give considered opinions about those things. And I think, the bottom line is I don't agree with every opinion that Father so-and-so gives about everything, or Bishop so-and-so gives, or Pope so-and-so gives about every particular situation. I do and am bound to agree as a loyal Catholic with them in matters of doctrines and moral principle.
Right.
And then it's up to our conscience to figure out how best to achieve that.
And those are the things, theology, doctrine, morals and stuff, those are the things I go to church to learn and to be directed in.
Right.
I don't want to be directed in who to vote for. I can do that myself.
I was at a mass a number of months ago at another parish I visited, where the priest had very strong political opinions and decided to use the homily to basically share his political opinions. And I was really turned off by that.
Yeah.
Not that the priest didn't have a right to have opinions.
Right.
Sure, he's a citizen, he's a person, he has a right to his opinions. And not that I shouldn't even maybe consider his viewpoints.
Right.
But I didn't like him hijacking the homily in the Mass to give me his thoughts on the election, whatever.
Yeah, because those things are, the Mass, all the elements of the Mass, those things are universal. But the political opinion is not.
Yeah. I think, to bring this to closure, I think in some measure this episode has been a failure because neither of us figured out how to work pulchritude or pulchritudinous into a sentence.
We're going to have to come up with a word for the next podcast that I'm involved in, and then we're going to have to.
Until then, let's bear in mind that the Catholic Church is about truth, goodness, and pulchritude.
There we go.
See?
There. We did it.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. But before you go, can I quickly ask you to do 5 things? First, please rate the podcast on whatever platform you listen on. That really moves it up in search rankings. Second, please write a review on either Apple Podcasts or on our website, consideringcatholicism.com. That encourages others who are searching for a Catholic podcast to try this one out. Third, please share it with others. Send them a link or post an episode on your social media. Fourth, please write me at consideringcatholicism.com or leave a comment on our website. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, and your stories. And finally, this podcast is 100% donor supported. My donors keep me going, they help cover my costs, and they let me dedicate more time to researching, writing, recording, and editing to get the episodes out to you faster. So please consider giving a one-time or recurring donation through the links in the show notes or on the website so that this ministry can continue and grow. And never forget, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, and Christus imperat.